Hello and welcome to the Through the Lens Darkly film discussion with Bill Batson. This program is part of the Black American Culture and Art series, The Legacy of Toni Morrison. The program is made possible with funds from the Decentralization Program, a re-grant program of New York State Council of the Arts with the support of Governor Cuomo and the New York State Legislature and administered by Arts Westchester. We're so happy to be able to offer programming while the doors to the physical library remain shut. I am your host, Tracy. Just a few things before our presenter Bill gets started. For privacy's sake, you should know that only people with the authentic Zoom link and password were allowed into this meeting, and it is being recorded. Today's program is a webinar. Bill will talk, share some visuals, and there will be a Q&A session at the end. To ask a question, click on the Q&A box on your Zoom bar and type. Bill will access your question near the end of the program. If anyone would prefer to ask their question verbally, please wait until the Q&A session and click on Raise Your Hand on your toolbar to be unmuted. Please observe the same courtesies you would if this program was at the library. We ask that you complete the exit survey at the end of the program so it can bring to you the best virtual experience possible in the future and have a better idea what programs to offer once the library opens again and we can see each other face to face. Please also visit our website, nyacklibrary.org, for further information on future programs. Our presenter today is Bill Batson. Bill Batson has published a sketch and short essay about the village of Nyack every Tuesday since 2011 on nyacknewsandviews.com. His family has been in Nyack, New York since the 1890s. Next year, Bill will celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Nyack Sketchlog and his 500th column. For the last 5 years, Bill has served as the marketing manager for the Nyack Chamber of Commerce and the artist in residence at the Nyack Farmers Market, where he sells and makes art, organizes events, and develops promotional tools for the chamber, a position he was furloughed from because of the COVID-19 pandemic. With Donna Tim, he co-founded the Nyack Mask Makers, a group of over 600 volunteers and donors who have created and distributed over 14,000 masks to frontline workers on the coronavirus front and general public. Bill is also a member of the committee negotiating police reforms in Rockland County with Nyack Center Assistant Director Nicole Hines, Father Owen Thompson, and Pastor Everett Newton. Bill is an advisor to the Nyack Center, a trustee of the Historical Society of the Nyacks, and the chair of the Nyack Commemoration Committee, a group that erected a Toni Morrison Society bench by the road monument in Nyack's Memorial Park in 2015. Bill chairs the Press and Publicity Committee for the Nyack branch of the NAACP. From his Nyack Sketchlog column, The Flash Sketch Mob, a crowdsourced landscape art project, and the Nyack Record Shop project have emerged. A lifelong artist and activist, Bill is dedicated to using the arts to promote preservation, commemoration, cultural education, and community empowerment. To learn more, follow his weekly column or visit billbatsonarts.com. Follow the Nyack Sketchlog on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you, Bill. Really appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning. Happy Juneteenth. This date gains more significance every year, but I don't imagine for a long time there's been a more significant year to honor this day at a moment when the entire world is focused on systemic racism as it presents itself through policing in our country, and as the death of George Floyd has focused all of us to this moment. And last year as well was the 400th year of the African presence in America. I'd like to thank the Nyack Library for breaking out of the February box and having a program of Black culture year-round in honor of Toni Morrison. I'd like to thank our partners, the Historical Society of Nyack, where, as she mentioned, I serve as a director, the Rivertown Film, the Village of Nyack, River, Writing Circle, the Toni Morrison Society. I'm going to share some images. They're presented, many of them were presented in the film Through the Lens Darkly, the 2014 film by Thomas Allen Harris, which the subtitle is The Emergence of a People. We showed this May 7th, and it was a very different world because George Floyd was alive. But I think even though his story is not depicted in the film, I think that's where it's important for me to start. So I'm going to screen share now. And please, Tracy, let me know if you can see my image. Can you see the first image? I, like all of you, learned about George Floyd, I believe by word of mouth, because very few things have affected the entire nation so quickly as this did. It was also a moment where the entire nation was brought together and placed at home in front of our media by the COVID pandemic. I knew about the death, and I'd already seen some of the protests before I chose to view the film. I really have a lot of trouble at this point in my life dealing with violence, particularly violence against people of color. I avoided it for a while, but I was mindful of the fact that a teenager actually took this footage, and when I posted this drawing, when I looked at the image, I couldn't look for long. I knew I'd only look at it once, and while I looked at it, I drew. So this is the drawing that I made, and when I was done with the drawing, my fiance said, "Wow, you know, the facial figures, you know, favor you." And I think a lot of us have felt that way. A lot of us have put ourselves in George Floyd's shoes. What will haunt me forever, even more than the awareness that this was actually probably the widest circulated snuff film ever, is that the face of the officer was stoic, nonchalant in the placement of his hand in his pocket. And I feel as though the nation was taken in a direction towards justice that had never been before. And the last time, you know, it was something that we will discuss and see in a moment. But this is how I like to think of George Floyd. I like to think of George Floyd in this this artwork here that was created by Kadir Nelson. The movement that's formed after his death has been called Say Their Names. That's the name of the legislation that Governor Andrew Cuomo has proposed, or the executive order he released on June 12th. And there is a long litany. When people want to know why these protests have spread so far and are so volatile, I think it's because it's not just 8 minutes and 46 seconds that are feeling that are have captured the Black community's attention, but it's 400 years plus 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And I was immediately mindful that the images that Kadir Nelson picked for his New York cover, which is for the New Yorker magazine, which is coming out on June 22nd, are many of the images that we will discuss in the film. And what you know, the documentarian presents to us is this constant interplay of a battle between images that are self-affirming and images that are socially negating. And to the extent that Black photographers have the lens, and to the extent that Black communities are pointing the lens, then our story is better told, and we're able to protect ourselves and advance our interests. But that battle has gone back and forth consistently. And as you see from the images, I'm going to go back and forth as well. But I will advise people when there are images that are difficult to see. As I said, I don't believe I'll ever watch the George Floyd video again. But I have to say, it's something that the whole world needed to see. But going back to the power that we have as photographers, the way that the director kind of situated what we're doing with film is creating a national family album, but that not everyone can pick what images show up in it is really powerful. And there was another interview where a person pointed out the difficulty that an African-American family had at the turn of the century in assembling themselves before a camera. The photographic, you know, services at that time were very expensive, and and life was extremely difficult. But for family photos, people wore their Sunday finest. And this photo here is of my family. The gentleman in the center is George T. Avery. He was, according to my research, one of the early staff members of the Nyack Library. This photo is around 1903, which was the year that the Carnegie Library was built in Nyack. In that same year, there were 84 lynchings in the United States of America, and that was a constant specter. These lynchings weren't just events that occurred in one place. They were broadcast in the media of that time through postcards that were shared liberally, and they also were staged as entertainment events with people attending to see a life snuffed out, very much like George Floyd. It would have been as if people assembled to witness intentionally the death of George Floyd. So around the same time, when the African American community, through its own devices, with its own resources, this family, just to speak a little bit more about my family, Nyack had a thriving middle-class Black community. We had gone in New York State, slavery was ended in 1827, but in the United States in 1863, Blacks were held as slaves, were legally held as slaves. So in 1883, my family bought this house. So 20 years, we went from property to property owners. It's quite an extraordinary achievement. And you can almost see in the determination and the strength in these faces. Someone else noted as well that in interplay between the races at this time in our history, it was extremely dangerous to look directly into the eyes of a white person for a Black person. But in these photos, you can see that the people are looking straight out, not only at the photographer, but also straight out, I believe, into history. At this same time, at around 1889, the Aunt Jemima brand was first advanced, and later in the 30s, the Uncle Ben brand. Until recently, there was a program about these images at the library a couple of months ago, and we all marveled that you could walk into any supermarket in America and buy a product that was being advanced by a African-American mascot. The fact that Aunt Jemima lost her handkerchief and had, kind of a relax or a perm, and that Uncle Ben may have, been dressed somewhat formally. These were tropes that were very common in the Jim Crow South. And this is a work by Renee Cox, advancing rather than a minstrel or a mascot, Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, but heroic figures representing those two figures. Well, the heroism of people on the street in the United States over the last 24 days since George Floyd's murder have shaken the foundations of American society, so much so that for hundreds of years, these brands, or at least in the case of Aunt Jemima, over 130 years, the brand existed. They exist no more. The Pepsi company that owns Aunt Jemima and Quaker House that own Quaker Foods that own Uncle Ben have retired both those brands. And we know that branding is what America is about. We don't just brand our corporate products, we brand a kind of nationalism. And the Confederate flag has been something that a lot of African Americans have unfortunately had to endure years after the Confederacy, which attempted to really destroy this nation and enslave Africans as its goal, was defeated. So at the same time, in the same week that Pepsi and Quaker abandoned Uncle Ben and Aunt Jemima, NASCAR has banned the Confederate flag. So I say the word branding actually a lot in my life. I have a small business. I'm concerned about what I do with my brand and where I put my brand. But we forget where that word came from. And you know, as chattel slaves, people were branded, and this is the trigger um, alert. The individual that I'm about to show from an 1863 Harper's Weekly was not specifically branded with the logo of a person, but certainly branded through the whipping, and black flesh was in fact branded. So this is the picture of Gordon, and this was used to demonstrate the incredible resilience and determination and courage and strength of enslaved Africans in this country. This appeared in Harper's Weekly, which was the most widely read journal during the Civil War, and it was someone who is exposed and vulnerable in this photograph. But Gordon was one of 187,000 African Americans who were a part of the Union Army, who fought to free themselves and to free their families and to ensure that there would be true democracy and liberty and justice for all. Oftentimes it's on the backs of African Americans in this picture, painfully, literally, that these justices that are put on paper are put in practice. And that's what a lot of people are doing today in the streets. But this photo also, there's a passage in the film where Carrie Mae Weems talks about humanizing these photos. Some of the daguerreotypes from this period were shocking in that they were the first use of nudity in photographs and commonly circulated photographs. But the folks that were putting them together, some of them, their intention was to expose the indignities and the outrages of slavery. There is a list of extraordinary folks that attempted to kind of reverse the chokehold, and that's another terrible phrase that we're using now, but we tried to reverse the logic of using images to oppress. And Sojourner Truth is an example of a person who used imagery she weaponized it in her fight for freedom. And her phrase as she sold, she was one of the most widely photographed, as was Frederick Douglass, individuals of her time in the 19th century. And her slogan was, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." And you can see that as the civil rights struggle has often been legal and has often taken place in a physical space, it has always been a bit of a media war. And some of the greatest leaders in African life have realized that you have to be able to manipulate images, and you have to be able to control your image and your representation. One of the examples of that, and he is an alliance with a great photographer. Oh, I'm sorry. This is an image of the AME Church in Nyack. I often try to find images that connect where we are in physical space to these historic events. And this church, my drawing of it is my family church. George T. Avery, who I introduced you to earlier, was a deacon of this church. And the AME Church was the Underground Railroad infrastructure. If you're looking for, if you're trying to recreate the footprint of that clandestine organization, you can easily use the places where these churches, the AME churches, are located. We have one here in Nyack on North Bird and Mill Street. And Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass were among the founding members of that church. But I mentioned earlier somebody who teamed up with a photographer. This is Marcus Garvey from the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association, sometimes known as the Back to Africa movement. And he was in partnership with James Vandersea, the great photographer from Harlem, to reposition how African Americans are looked at. The images from the kind of Jim Crow notion of an African American pursued, you know, the degradation of notions of laziness and ignorance. And quite frankly, that was so, you know, radically different than the photos in the family albums of the African American community, but the public weren't seeing them. So people like Marcus Garvey formed relationships with photographers like James Vanderzee, and also W.B. Du Bois. He's known for so many things, but he was the founder of the Crisis magazine, and he understood very well the job of being an organizer was also being able to manipulate images and share them widely. The last person I want to mention, and it's kind of out of sequence historically, but Toni Morrison, I believe, did an extraordinary thing through the Bench by the Road project. And even though it's not a bench that she created through photography or through visual arts, it now is an iconic image. During the civil rights movement, innocuous public accommodations like a water fountain or a seat in a bus took on extremely important significance and became symbols of resistance. Well, now in 25 communities around the nation, there are these benches that are used to signify and celebrate the African diaspora. And this is Toni Morrison in Nyack in 2015 dedicating this bench by the road. So in the same way that you can visit the St. Philip's Church on North Broad and Mill, this bench is in Memorial Park. It's across the street from the Nyack Historical Society, and it's also right down the street from a property owned by Cynthia Hesdra, an escaped slave who became an entrepreneur and an abolitionist, and she is the woman who this bench is named after. So I'm just going to go through a couple of more images where we're no longer necessarily talking about just who is in the picture, but who's directing the picture, but exactly what's being captured. And this is where I think the civil rights movement began to understand how the media and the news shape world events. The decision by the mother of Emmett Till to show his face on Jet magazine was probably, before George Floyd, one of the more impactful images that has changed American history and the treatment of African Americans. I chose not to show his face after he was beaten and thrown into the river in Money, Mississippi. But I realized that we can look at him and remember him for what his mother thought of him, and we don't need to always see those images, but certainly before Floyd, as I said, Emmett Till was extremely important. And when I showed you the photograph of, or the drawing by Cotter Nelson, he includes Emmett Till as one of those images, and he includes this image, actually not his disfigured face. This photograph right here is maybe not widely known, but it does play a very important role in how the federal government and the business community began to look at the persistence of violent segregationist forces in the South. This was in 1961. And at the time that this bus, which was full of freedom riders, was all the freedom riders were pulled out and beaten beaten bloody with serious injuries. And the bus was set on fire. The news media was on site and took this photograph. And one morning in Japan, a delegation from Anniston, Alabama, which was near some very significant metallurgy mines and businesses. The industry was there in Japan trying to make some money, trying to sell some business. They were immediately disinvited from the delegation. Was sent home. They told to pack their bags and go back to Alabama because the Japanese government did not want to be affiliated with a state that would treat their citizens of color in this manner. These photos here were so devastating when the civil rights acts of 65 were being debated. This is from what's called sometimes the Children's Crusade, but it's also Project C. It was a project of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Birmingham, Alabama. The police chief of that time, Bull Connor, used dogs and fire hoses on innocent protesters. This resonates today because there was a recent threat from the President of the United States to use dogs on nonviolent protesters in Washington, D.C. The fire department has not been deployed, but we see a great connection between these kinds of images. Well, when the President of the United States at that time, Lyndon B. Johnson, saw this, it moved him to immediately pursue the negotiations, which led to the Voting Rights Act. But there's another image that is really meaningful for me, and it may be not, it might well be not as widely known, but this is from a photo I saw in Martin Luther King's book, Why We Can't Wait. And if you notice, there's a young girl with her back against the fence. I've thought about this a lot recently in Nyack, because the protests that have been ongoing and that led to 23 days of protests were started by the Teen Youth Council. And but even younger children participated in the civil rights movement. Part of the strategy in the South was to fill the jails. If you could fill the jails and there was nowhere for them to detain anyone, then you were at a point where the police power was irrelevant and you could succeed in your negotiations. But in Birmingham, they got quite creative. So when the jails filled, they used schools. They filled school buildings and school yards. And then they used parks, and they continued to find bodies to send into the protest. But eventually somebody told Dr. King that, we've used all the high school students, we've used all the elementary school students, and James Bevel brought forward a delegation of elementary school students that were willing to stand to get arrested. And it was a very provocative notion, and a lot of people in the civil rights movement were opposed to it, and the government was extremely upset with it, and there was a lot of editorials against it. But Dr. King was reminded by James Bevel that in the Baptist Church, at the age of 6, you can join and become a member, and you can make a decision about your eternal life. So therefore, the feeling was that if a young person wanted to participate in a struggle to determine how they could live on this planet, that they should be able to. This image here is also in Cotter Nelson's image on the New Yorker, and it also appears in the Harris film. I Am a Man was a powerful, very simple, provocative notion. It reminds me a lot of Black Lives Matter. It's a statement that's really hard to refute. It speaks to the core of living and existence. This line of march was one of the last things that Dr. Martin Luther King saw in his life. This was in Memphis. These are the sanitation workers. And once again, you could see that when it's important for making a certain kind of presentation, there are a lot of gentlemen wearing clothes that they would normally wear to church. I'm sure there was a lot of praying involved. These marches were very frightening, and there was a lot of tension in Memphis at this time. This picture was taken by Ernest Withers, who's a photographer who was also mentioned in Harris's film. But all this does lead us to today. Those students from the Nyack Center who have been leading these marches have kind of changed our community. This is a photograph that I took last night at around, oh, I'm sorry. No, this was a photograph taken by Kim Cross last night. I was there a little bit earlier. That's a local artist, Dan White, and that is Black Power Fist painted on Main Street. So in the same way that images can tell the story of one person and what happens, images, there was a narrator in the film that said, can an image, unite a divided nation? COVID kind of put us all in the same room. And then I believe that this televised lynching of George Floyd, in a way, has brought some unity. Certainly, there are forces that are opposed to, police reform, and there's still systemic racism in every, branch of living and corner of our country. But I do believe it's in retreat. I do feel hopeful. This is the way that I started with, the way that I met George Floyd as a person, deprived of his rights, but now he is truly, as this image shows, larger than life. And I hope that his, sacrifice will lead to something. And I hope that we will continue to say the names of the other folks. That's what a lot of this movement has been called, say their names. So Rashard Brookses, who actually lost his life since then, but so quickly, these cases are so different now. The officer in the Brooks case in Atlanta, he was shot in a Wendy's parking lot in the back. He's already been charged with felony murder. It does seem like we live in a different world, but it will take photographers, and it will take activists, and it will take all of us to work together to make sure that the emergence of a people is into a free country, and that's what we've all wanted for more than 400 years. So I understand that there are some questions. I know that there was an early question, so I'm hoping that Tracy will join me again.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, Tracy.
Hi. We have, the one question. It was, hi, Bill. I attempted to show the Through the Lens Darkly video in one of my photography classes. One student was very turned off about the lynching scenes and didn't know how to respond to her professionally. Any thoughts?
Well, I believe that the importance, in a way, outweighs the discomfort. Part of what images of a violent act and a violent act are very different things, the civil rights movement is, or part of the Kingian civil rights movement is based on this notion of creative tension, that there has to be a way to move a person to act and to make it difficult to avoid something. Difficult to ignore something that's been avoided for a very long time. But I do believe that there has to be sensitivities. I think that we've all felt with this most recent case that it is almost too much to bear. I do worry about the way that media is so prevalent that parents don't have the ability to control whether kids are seeing this or not. And certainly there's a trauma to seeing images like this. So I think that it's a very important discussion to have as to how and when material like this is shared. And we did give a trigger when we showed the slaves scarred back, but I do think that if these images were not shown in the process of being shown offending some people, but if they hadn't been shown, we would not be having these conversations that we're having today.
Thanks. So the Q&A session's open. If anybody has any more questions, feel free to add it, type it in the Q&A part, or you can raise your hand and you can speak. While we're waiting, what did you think of the film, Bill?
I felt that I was invited in through the whole notion of the family album. As an artist, I've returned to photographs of my family to base work on and to contemplate, the distance we've traveled as a people. I know that the images are powerful and tools by many very important artists. I loved the fact that, once again, Nyack has a great connection to some of these stories. Carrie Mae Weems, who is one of the most important photographers in the world right now, was the recipient of an Edward Hopper Award that inspired the Nyack Record Shop project. So kind of drawing from the inspiration of the work of some of the people in that film, we were able to collect over 30 oral histories that we donated to the Nyack Library, and making sure that collection is representative. I'm just mindful of the fact that, and I think that is one of the lessons here, is that the narrative of America is being written as we speak. And so the more that we can direct, how those images are being generated and how they're being distributed, we can protect ourselves, our communities, and advance our interests.
Agreed. Yeah. I have one question from Angela, who's, I think it's Angela Strong, our director. It's, what is the best outcome for this current movement to finally address police brutality?
Well, thank you, Angela. I I think that the best outcome is to have a thoughtful and prolonged discussion so that we don't have to come here again. There's always a great deal of frustration that movements have come and gone, and major reforms have never really been secured. I mean, one issue that comes to mind so quickly is voting. We showed the images of those terrible, you know, encounters in Birmingham, Alabama, and right now, voter suppression is probably at its all-time high. In a lot of places, the Voting Rights Act is expired and is no longer, you know, in effect. So I would hope that it wouldn't be considered by anybody a sprint, that this is a marathon, and that just very thoughtful, reflective, you know, work will go into negotiating some real change. And the fact that the governor of the state is asked for all communities to sit down and have a dialogue with law enforcement is very, very important. And ultimately, it's really going to create, I think, you know, prosperity and security for everyone, because we certainly, you know, want to be able to close a chapter on slavery. And it seems like this country, maybe there's the need for something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that South Africa had, but we've never really been able to close the chapter. And with, you know, people are concerned about mass incarceration in the same way. It seems like some of the things that we thought were problems of the 20th and the 19th and the 17th century still are very, you know, present.
Thanks. We have a couple more. Next one is, I lost connection for a few minutes. Can you mention the Underground Railroad sites locally again? It's from Colette.
Okay, well, the location of the sites are very difficult. There are feelings about it, but to you know, to officially designate a site requires a great deal of work, because, as I said, they're clandestine. There was never really any kind of official, you know, official status. But in Nyack, we have a feeling that Jersey City, Nyack, and Newburgh were kind of the local stops along this side of the Hudson River, and I think that sites that you could say are relevant to the Underground Railroad in Nyack would be the AME Zion Church on North Mill and Bird, the St. Charles Church in Sparkle. They're both AME churches, and the Bench by the Road, which is in Memorial Park. And then there's other feature which is very exciting. There's a historian named Mike Hayes who found the identity of the last person held as a slave in our community, and that was a guy named Peter Williamson, who was involved in the building of the stone church in Upper Nyack and lived next door to it. So if you ever wanted to touch a structure that was constructed with slave labor, you could visit the stone meeting house in Upper Nyack.
Okay, Cheryl asks, what role do you see the non-Black photographers and artists playing in the Black Lives Matters movement? How can they best amplify messages and Black voices?
I think that the oral history approach is very important. While we do realize, and this film celebrates the power of the image, sometimes context is important too. And I'm very moved by the fact that a lot of, it seems to be a trend in America now, but often, like with Megan's Law, that laws are taking on the names of people, and the fact that there's now a Kersey law because of a gentleman in Schenectady, Andrew Kersey, who pled for medical attention and was denied it. So now there's a law that when you are in custody and you request medical attention, it has to be given to you right away. So, and when his widow recently spoke about it, she mentioned the fact that there were 70 requests for medical attention in 17 minutes. So details like that become so powerful. So, and I also often know from the media right now that, for instance, the still photographers that go out from LOHUD and other publications, I know that, you know, people have disciplines and have tools that they like to use, but it's not only still photography that's really important right now. Video, like in this George Floyd case, is so powerful. So I would, you know, if you have a great picture that is evocative, if you could find one of the people in that photo and turn on the video function on your phone or on your camera and talk to them a little bit and find out what their story is and what their name is. And I think that that is a way that really humanizes the issues here, and it's easier for people to enter in and participate.
Matthew Sake, who is one of our Rivertown Films, one of our partners, he asked, one of the points of the film is that the story of our lives is told through art, and therefore representation, all artistic disciplines matters. Only music is well represented by Black Americans. Lately, we are seeing a little more representation in film in front and behind the camera. Studies show that Black Americans participate in the arts in higher numbers than Caucasians, but we are not seeing representation in other disciplines, for that matter, the representation of women. As an artist yourself, how do we change this? And then he also says, among other locate connections, the filmmaker lives in Greenwood Lake.
Well, I believe that there's concern right now because we're going to experience an economic contraction after this pandemic, and I often worry, Matthew, that the arts are often the first category on the chopping block. So I think fighting for arts funding in general is important, and I mean, that's a very difficult question, and there are people much smarter than I and more familiar with that specific issue that could weigh in. But my hunch is that if we can support institutions that cultural institutions and keep them viable, I do believe that there is a change going on right now. One example would be veterans from the news industry who covered the unrest in the 70s and 60s said that the anti-war movement, which was one of the largest kind of mass demonstration waves in our country, were predominantly white and predominantly in big cities. And the civil rights struggle was, you know, either urban or in the South, and it was predominantly Black with you know, some representation. But in 50 states across America, these demonstrations are very diverse and very different, and the world is changing. So when we do get back to school, and we do get back to work, and we do get back to visiting and going downtown, I think if we all kind of crowdsourced that notion that the arts are important and they make us stronger and they're a tool of liberation, and if we all supported the arts and made sure that arts organizations were viable, I believe on the other side of these movements that it will be easier for you know, LGBTQ and people of color and women to find resources to support their work.
Thanks. Colette says thank you, and then she also has a statement. I'm part of an African-American photography collection called Kimonog. I'm sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly. We have been around since 1963 in Harlem. We have published a few books, and she teaches fine arts photography, and she's recognized in the field. I'm not sure if you've heard of them. But.
Well, you know, absolutely. And I do believe also in the county, I believe Colette is affiliated with the CGIS Institute as well, which is an important local cultural resource.
And then I think there's one more. From Georgia, it's, do you know of any good resources for discovering more African-American artists? Do you have any favorites?
Well, I am, there's the fact that I was able to work with Carrie Mae Weems recently was very powerful. Romare Bearden and Jacob Lawrence are kind of my kind of personal favorites and artists that have meant a lot to me. And certainly with Jacob Lawrence, the way that he's used his art to kind of document the Great Migration and important periods in African American life. David Simmons is a sculptor whose work means a lot to me. But you know, the incredible resources that we have available now for us online, you know, can bring this work to you. I'm really hugely influenced by those artists.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Tracy, and thanks to the library, and thanks for those that joined us. And I know that in town, in the town of Nyack at 5 o'clock, there's a Juneteenth celebration going on in the middle of town, and in Nyack today is an official Juneteenth holiday. So thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to what's the next program for in your series.
Lori Martin's going to do a discussion of Beloved.
Oh, wonderful. And that's Lori Martin?
Yeah, that's going to be in August.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. It's very sad. As the result of the pandemic, we had to cancel the African American Day Parade, which was going to be on June 6th. And Lori was our Grand Marshal. So we will, when we have parades again, we'll have Lori back in town.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And thank you again, Bill. You're always a pleasure to work with. Have a good day, everybody. Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you.